The name of the operation was not chosen by accident. Fish was simple. Fish was ordinary. Fish was forgettable. And that was exactly why it worked. During wartime, ports were full of suspicion. Every unusual movement could attract attention. Every heavy crate could create questions. Every armed guard, every sealed container, every restricted dock could become a signal to enemy spies that something important was happening. But fish? Nobody found that strange. A ship loaded with thousands of crates of fish crossing the Atlantic was completely believable. Britain and Canada already had strong maritime trade. Cargoes of seafood moved regularly between ports. Barrels, boxes, ice, salt, and sealed holds were all normal parts of that business. Even better, fish had one natural advantage that no official disguise could easily create. It smelled. The strong odor made people less eager to inspect the cargo closely. Opening crate after crate would be unpleasant, slow, and messy. If a dock worker was told that the boxes contained preserved fish, there was little reason to argue. If a casual observer saw the loading process, nothing about it seemed valuable or mysterious. Behind that disguise, however, was one of the most valuable cargoes ever moved by sea. Gold bars were packed and hidden among ordinary-looking containers. Banknotes, bonds, certificates, and private securities were prepared for shipment. Much of the cargo belonged not only to the British state, but also to companies and private citizens whose financial assets had been taken under wartime control. Most people involved in the loading process did not know the truth. Dock workers were told they were handling fish. Sailors were told they were transporting routine wartime cargo. Even some officers knew only what they needed to know. Secrecy depended on ignorance. The fewer people who understood the real mission, the lower the chance of a leak. To move the treasure quickly, normal rules were pushed aside. Ships were loaded to extreme levels. Weight limits that would usually be treated with caution became flexible. If a vessel could carry the cargo and still sail, it was used. This created new dangers. Gold is incredibly dense. A small amount can place enormous pressure on a deck or storage area. If loaded badly, it could damage a ship's structure or affect its stability in rough seas. During Operation Fish, some vessels were packed so heavily that their frames and lower compartments were placed under serious strain. But speed mattered more than comfort. On May 30th, 1940, the first major shipment of the operation left Britain for Canada. The vessel carried assets worth around £40 million at the time, a fortune equal to billions today. More ships soon followed. Passenger liners were converted. Naval vessels were adapted. Every available space was used. Some carried gold. Others carried paper wealth, bonds, stock certificates, and financial documents that could be sold or used as collateral. To anyone outside the secret circle, these ships looked like ordinary wartime transports. But inside their holds, Britain's ability to keep fighting was being carried across the Atlantic. Each voyage was a gamble. A single German submarine could destroy enough wealth to shake the entire British war effort. A storm could send gold to the bottom of the ocean. A mechanical failure could leave a ship helpless in waters where U-boats were hunting. Yet the convoys continued. Because Britain had already reached the point where doing nothing was more dangerous than taking the risk. Operation Fish was now fully underway. One of the most dangerous voyages of Operation Fish began on June 24, 1940. The ship was HMS Emerald, a Royal Navy cruiser that had already played a role in earlier secret movements of British wealth. But this time, her mission was far more extreme. Before departure, Emerald was stripped down and refitted to carry as much cargo as possible. Comfort no longer mattered. Efficiency did. Every available corner of the ship was turned into storage space. Compartments that had once served normal naval purposes were filled with gold, documents, bonds, and financial certificates. The cargo was almost beyond imagination. On board were around £30 million in gold, together with roughly £200 million in securities. In modern value, this represented many billions. It was not simply a shipment. It was a floating piece of the British financial system. Every part of the vessel was packed. Storage rooms were filled. Ammunition spaces were repurposed. Even areas normally reserved for officers were used to hold financial papers. A representative of the Bank of England, sent to supervise the treasure, reportedly had to sleep surrounded by money because there was barely any normal space left. At first, Emerald did not sail alone. She was escorted by Royal Navy destroyers as she moved into the cold waters of the North Atlantic, but then the weather turned violent. A major storm struck the convoy. Destroyers were fast and useful in combat, but they were not ideal for enduring brutal Atlantic conditions over long distances. Their fuel range was limited, and in heavy weather they could be battered badly. As the storm worsened, the escorting ships were forced to turn back. That left Emerald alone. A single cruiser, overloaded with one of the most valuable cargoes in history, crossing an ocean where German submarines were hunting. The danger beneath the waves was growing every week. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany was developing a new submarine tactic that would soon terrify Allied shipping: the Wolf Pack. The idea was simple but deadly. U-boats would spread out across likely shipping routes, searching for convoys. When one submarine found a target, it did not always attack immediately. Instead, it followed the convoy, reported its position, speed, and direction, then waited while other U-boats gathered nearby. At night, they would strike together. This allowed German submarines to overwhelm escorts and attack from several directions. Even guarded convoys could be devastated. Ships carrying food, weapons, fuel, and raw materials were sent to the bottom of the Atlantic with frightening speed. Only days before Emerald left Britain, German U-boats had already shown how deadly this method could become. In one attack on an Allied convoy, several merchant ships were sunk and tens of thousands of tons of cargo were lost. Hundreds of sailors faced death in the freezing sea. And now Emerald was sailing without escorts. If a U-boat found her, the result could have been catastrophic. A single torpedo might have sent Britain's gold and securities to the ocean floor. Worse still, Germany might have learned what the ship was carrying. The psychological and financial shock would have been enormous. Yet Emerald kept going. Through storm, darkness, and submarine-infested waters, she crossed the Atlantic alone. Her survival depended on secrecy, weather, distance, and luck. On July 1, 1940, HMS Emerald reached Halifax safely. The ship had suffered some damage from the storm, but the treasure was intact. Not a single major part of the cargo had been lost. For Britain, it was a near miracle. But Operation Fish was not finished. In fact, only a few days later, an even larger and more valuable convoy would sail. One that carried a fortune so vast it became one of the richest shipments ever moved across the ocean. 4 days after HMS Emerald reached Canada, Operation Fish entered its most dramatic phase. A new convoy prepared to leave Britain. This time, the scale was almost unbelievable. 5 ships would cross the Atlantic carrying a combined cargo worth around £450 million at the time, equal to tens of billions today. It was one of the most valuable shipments ever sent across the sea. Among the vessels were luxury liners that had been converted for wartime use, along with naval ships assigned to protect and support the mission. These were not ordinary cargo vessels. They were moving vaults, packed with gold, securities, and financial documents that could determine whether Britain could keep buying the weapons and supplies it needed to survive. But the ocean did not make the journey easy. For much of the crossing, the convoy moved through thick fog. Visibility dropped dangerously low. Fog could hide the ships from enemy aircraft and submarines, but it also created new risks. Ships could lose formation. Signals became harder to manage. Icebergs and drifting ice were almost invisible until they were dangerously close. Then came mechanical trouble. One of the converted liners suffered engine problems and stopped in the open sea. For any ship, this would be serious. For a ship carrying a fortune, in waters where German submarines might appear at any moment, it was terrifying. The crew worked under extreme pressure to restore power. Every hour spent drifting increased the danger. A U-boat did not need to know the ship's cargo. It only needed a target. Yet despite fog, ice, engine failure, and constant fear of submarine attack, the convoy survived. All 5 ships reached Canada safely. Not one major shipment was lost. Within only a few weeks, Operation Fish had moved a large part of Britain's national wealth across the Atlantic. Looking back, the success seems almost impossible. The cargo was enormous. The sea routes were deadly. German submarines were active. Weather conditions were brutal. And yet the operation ended with only minor incidents. So how did Britain pull it off? The answer was secrecy. Gold was moved inside Britain mostly at night. Ships departed quietly, often from different ports such as Plymouth, Liverpool, and Greenock. The movements were staggered so no obvious pattern would emerge. At sea, radio silence was strictly maintained. Every unnecessary message was a risk. A signal could be intercepted. A position could be guessed. A careless transmission could guide submarines directly toward the convoy. Even the weather became part of the disguise. Many ships deliberately sailed during storms or poor conditions. Bad weather made the journey more dangerous, but it also reduced the chance of being spotted. The convoys avoided familiar shipping lanes and took difficult routes that enemy patrols were less likely to monitor closely. The secrecy was so strict that even parts of the British government were left uninformed. The War Risks Insurance Office was reportedly not told the full details of every voyage. If a ship had been sunk, there might have been no normal insurance protection for the loss. That was the level of risk Britain accepted. Operation Fish succeeded because it treated secrecy as armor. Not steel armor, not naval armor, but informational armor. The fewer people knew, the fewer people could talk. The fewer signals were sent, the fewer clues the enemy could follow. And when the last ships reached Canadian waters, the mission was still only half complete. Now the treasure had to disappear again. Not into the ocean, but into the vaults, basements, and hidden financial fortresses of Canada. When the ships reached Canada, the danger did not simply end at the harbor. The treasure still had to be unloaded, checked, guarded, transported, and hidden. Every step had to be done quickly, quietly, and without attracting public attention. A single leak could expose the entire operation. A single theft, accident, or mistake could cause a scandal during one of the most dangerous moments in British history. As each ship arrived, Canadian ports were locked down. Armed guards sealed the docks. Government officials and banking representatives inspected the crates. The cargo was counted and checked again before it was moved from the ships to waiting trains. These were not ordinary railway cars. Their floors had to carry extreme weight, especially when loaded with gold. Guards were placed inside and around them. Security followed the treasure at every stage. Then the trains moved inland. Their destination was Montreal, one of Canada's major financial centers. From there, trucks carried the cargo through streets protected by strict security arrangements. Most citizens had no idea what was happening. To them, it may have looked like another wartime transfer, another government shipment, another guarded convoy moving through the city. But inside those trucks was a fortune large enough to influence the course of the war. The most important storage site became the Sun Life building in Montreal. At the time, it was one of the largest office buildings in the British Commonwealth. Above ground, thousands of employees continued their daily work as if nothing unusual was happening. They typed letters, handled accounts, answered telephones, and walked through corridors without realizing that beneath them lay one of the greatest hidden treasures in modern history. The basement was transformed into a secure financial fortress. There was one major problem. Canada's existing vaults were already close to full. Britain was not the only country trying to protect its national wealth. Other European governments, threatened or already overrun by Nazi Germany, had also sent gold and valuables across the Atlantic, so Canada had to create more space fast. A new underground vault system was built beneath the Sun Life building. Workers broke through concrete, expanded storage areas, and reinforced the structure. Because wartime shortages made steel difficult to obtain, builders reportedly reused rail from an abandoned railway line to strengthen parts of the vault. A massive vault door was brought in from the Royal Bank of Canada and installed into thick, reinforced concrete. On the surface, heavy materials such as sand, cement, stone, and water were used to add protection. The goal was simple: make the hidden chamber strong enough to resist fire, theft, sabotage, and possibly even air attack. The vault was protected by alarms and guarded day and night by Canadian security forces. Access was tightly controlled. Workers involved in the project were sworn to secrecy. The operation depended not only on soldiers and bankers, but also on ordinary laborers who did their jobs and said nothing. Inside the Sun Life building, most of the paper wealth was stored. Stocks, bonds, certificates, and financial records filled hundreds of filing cabinets. These documents might not have looked as impressive as gold bars, but in wartime they were extremely powerful. They could be sold, transferred, used as collateral, or converted into buying power. In other words, they helped Britain continue purchasing the supplies it needed to fight. The gold itself was mostly sent to Ottawa. There, the Bank of Canada's vaults on Wellington Street still had enough room to hold a large part of the bullion. As the shipments arrived, Ottawa became one of the greatest gold storage centers outside the United States. By the end of the war, records showed that more than 186,000 gold bars and hundreds of tons of sealed coins had been stored in Canadian vaults on behalf of Britain and other allied nations. Canada's role was remarkable. It provided security, secrecy, storage, and cooperation at a scale few countries could have managed. Even more striking, Canada did not treat the treasure as an opportunity for profit. The assets were protected and preserved until they could be returned or used as needed. For years, thousands of people worked above and around this hidden fortune without knowing the truth. Beneath ordinary offices, beneath quiet streets, beneath the calm surface of Canadian wartime life, Britain's financial lifeline was waiting in the dark, guarded, counted, and ready to keep the war effort alive. Canada did not charge Britain large storage fees. It did not exploit the crisis for profit. Instead, it quietly guarded the treasure until the danger had passed. For years, hundreds of Canadian workers, guards, railway staff, bankers, and officials handled parts of the operation in silence. Many worked long shifts in vaults, basements, and secure facilities without revealing what they had seen. The secret held. Only in 1946, after the war was over, did the public begin to understand the true scale of Operation Fish. Looking back today, it is easy to say Britain was never invaded, and that perhaps the gold could have stayed in London. But in 1940, nobody could know that. France had fallen. German aircraft were preparing to attack British cities. U-boats were spreading across the Atlantic. The future of the war was uncertain. If Nazi Germany had captured Britain's financial reserves, the consequences could have been disastrous. Hitler would have gained wealth, leverage, and perhaps the ability to prolong the war even further. So Britain gambled. It sent its treasure into storms, fog, submarine waters, and secrecy. It trusted Canada with one of the greatest fortunes ever moved in modern history. And against all odds, the operation succeeded. Operation Fish was not a battlefield victory. No army marched, no city was captured, no flag was raised. But without money, wars cannot be fought. And by saving its wealth, Britain helped save its ability to resist. If you enjoyed this story and want more hidden chapters of history brought back to life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are still many secret operations, forgotten decisions, and unbelievable true stories waiting to be uncovered.